The Sine Institute of Policy and Politics is American University's incubator for policy innovation. We convene leaders in the academic, public, private, nonprofit, and journalism sectors to engage and promote common ground and nonpartisan solutions. In an evolving world, we seize the opportunity to work on the nation's most pressing challenges through collaboration by experts and top scholars in their field with students in research and scholarship. As part of that goal, the Sine Institute leverages American University's location in our nation's capital, the nexus of government and a growing international business center. We connect diverse perspectives from around the country and around the world with our world-class academics and research, experienced practitioners, and the most politically active student body in the U.S. We stand apart through our focus on the role of business and the nonprofit community in public policy, the rise of the importance of economic regions in the United States, and international policy issues. Our focus is to make an immediate impact at the intersection of policy and politics that leads to real and lasting change. Thank you for joining us as we convene, communicate, and collaborate.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for coming in person. If you're here with us in person, or those of us who are on the live stream, we're so happy to have you with us. Thank you guys. We put on this amazing event. We're so excited to have you. And in particular, we're so excited to be co-sponsoring with COGOB Women in Business who are with us today. And so I'll go ahead and pass over the mic to them and let them introduce our amazing speakers for this event. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you all for being here. It is a pleasure to be able to introduce our distinguished lecturers and this amazing topic. My name is Florence. I'm here on behalf of the COGOB Women in Business, a proud co-sponsor of this event. We are a graduate student club based in the COGOB School of Business, and our vision is to develop leadership skills, connect students with the inclusive COGOB Women's Network, and break boundaries in their professional careers. For that reason, we are thrilled to partner with the Sine Institute of Politics and Policy on this event. The Sine Institute is an incubator for policy innovation, bringing together the best and brightest minds in the private, public, and nonprofit sectors. They spark meaningful discourse on important issues, and without them, we would not be able to invite distinguished fellows like the one we have here today. With that, I am honored to introduce 2024 Spring Sine Fellow, the Honorable Manisha Singh. She is a leader at the cross-section of both the public and private sectors, and most recently, she worked as Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of Economic and Business Affairs at the State Department, where she led over 250 officers. During this time, she also pioneered the Power Program, which is providing opportunities for women's economic rise. And this aims to promote women businesses across the globe. Her program even now continues to be at the forefront of the Bureau's work. Currently, Manisha serves as founder and principal at the Sunstone Strategy Group. Fellow Manisha Singh is joined by Ambassador Jayme White, who most recently served as Senate-confirmed Deputy United States Trade Representative, and he has over 20 years of experience in negotiating trade deals and shaping legislation on a variety of issues like international trade, intellectual property, and the digital economy. Without further ado, let's give our distinguished lecturers a hand and welcome them in this discussion on the economics and impact of globalization.
Thank you so much, Florence, for that very warm and wonderful welcome. And I'm so excited that the Sine Institute is co-sponsoring this program with the COGOB Women in Business. And as you pointed out, Florence, for me, not only women in business, but I feel like the benefits of the economy should reach the full spectrum of economic participation. And so the Power Program was started to help women not just get promoted in companies, but also to start their own enterprises. I feel like everyone should be an entrepreneur. So thank you to COGOB Women in Business, and especially to Amy Dacey and her fantastic team at the Sine Institute. I've had a great group of student associates who've helped put together this program. So we're very happy to talk about this topic, which I think is very relevant and it's very timely considering all the news, everything going on in the economy, not just here in the United States, but around the globe. And I'm especially pleased to have my good friend, Ambassador Jayme White, here with me. Someone had asked how long we've known each other, and Ambassador White and I worked on the Hill 20 years ago, many decades ago, maybe probably before some of you were born. So that shows you that the friendships and the partnerships that you're making now, at some point, you might be sitting on the panel with someone next to you today, having a conversation about the economy or whatever subject matter interests you. So many of you, I think, have gotten a copy of my book. And the reason that Amy and I talked about handing out this book is because when you read the story, it's a fiction story, but when you read the story, you'll understand its link to the economics and impact of globalization. I'll just give you a quick summary. So our protagonist in the book, John Mitchell, is someone who works outside of Detroit. And we know that industrial areas like Detroit and Pittsburgh, their economies really have been significantly impacted by manufacturing going overseas. So these areas that the very local economy, changes. It changes the shape of the workforce. It changes what people do, how people think. And another part of the story is the decisions made in Washington. And this takes place in 2008, the financial crisis. This is when TARP and all those big decisions were happening. All of the decisions that we make here in Washington. And so this is something that both business students, policy students certainly are going to be interested in, that these policy decisions have a real world impact on the health and welfare of people, of families. The story takes you through not just happens to what our protagonist, John, but to his wife, to his kids. There's a part where I'm not going to spoil too much, but where he goes through an inability to pay his mortgage. And what does he do? So it's food for thought for you all, because I'm expecting all of you to become leaders in the public and the private sector. So this is a book that I hope will stay with you, just in terms of the themes and the effects of what we do here on the American people. And so that's the perfect segue to Ambassador Jayme White. So as I mentioned, Ambassador White and I worked together on the Hill. He previously worked for Senator Ron Wyden from Oregon, some of you may know. And Oregon, of course, has a big technology economy as part of the state, and Ambassador White may talk about that. Of course, his last position was as Deputy United States Trade Representative to Ambassador Catherine Tai, who is the current United States Trade Representative. And I wanted him to just give an overview of his view of trade over the last several decades. Ambassador White, I think you were there in Seattle. Some of you may have read about the WTO meeting that happened in Seattle that basically erupted into a lot of civil strife. They had to shut down the city. And so Ambassador White was there. So this is the type of experience that he's bringing to the conversation. So with that, Ambassador White, I'm going to turn to you for remarks. And at the end, hopefully you all will have questions.
Thanks, Manisha. It's really great to be here, and thanks for inviting me and for hosting me. Naturally, I came in with some notes to myself that are organized, and then listening to you, my intro is completely different. So I remember, I think the first thing we worked on together on the Hill was when I was on the House side, and we were trying to renew something called the African Growth and Opportunity Act. And that's what we call a trade preference program towards sub-Saharan Africa that cut out import duties on products from Africa. And we were trying to renew it. And we got it out of the House, and it was stuck in the Senate. And somebody I know found a way to get Bono to come to the Senate Committee on Finance and urge a couple of senators that were holding things up to stop the hold. And about a week later, I think we UC'd that bill.
UC'd means unanimous consent.
Yes. So no objections, no vote required. And that is
so you can get Bono on the scene. All of a sudden, the senators start listening.
And of course, I never forgot about that. But about 6 months ago, I was at something, and somebody that worked on that event brought this printout of a photo with me and Bono. and some senators. He's like, I've had this for 20 years. Anyway, Bono looks different. Bono is not as tall as you might think. I'm also reminded, hearing about the focus on women in business, that's really, it's important for so many reasons that you know far better than I. But I'm reminded of this experience I had a long time ago. I was going to grad school at night, and I was very keen on trade, development, et cetera. And there was a program called Gender and Development. It was a night class because I worked on the Hill. So naturally, I'm late for school. And I think it was the first day and, the first night. And when you're late and you don't have like your assigned or the place you usually sit, you open the door. And for me, it was always like, if you come in with coffee, it looks like you were really busy doing something, even though you're just late. So I open the door and I see the first available desk and I sit down. And then I hear this applause. And I'm like, what did I do? Just, and then I look around, I'm the only guy in the room. Gender and development. And it's really quite amazing. As I'm sure you know, when you empower women, anywhere, they make better decisions for their families, for their communities, for whether it's a county they live in or the country they live in. It's you're better off empowering women if you care about development and the human condition in general. So it's great to be here. I will try to be as succinct as one can be when we talk about globalization. It's such a narrow topic. Let me just kind of tell you how I think of globalization and how some of my experiences and how I've approached my jobs and opportunities and challenges. I sort of come into this conversation thinking to myself, where were we after the Second World War? What do we do? We being the West, right? And we had lots of choices as that war ended. And the choices we made were really the Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank, the IMF, and GATT. And those institutions were really designed to link economies together. There was this feeling that if we got along economically, that would help address poverty, empower people, and encourage us all to all work together instead of not so much. And a couple of years ago, I went back to look at, kind of just do a snapshot on where we were in the 1950s and where we were at the time. This is 3-4 years ago. And my takeaway was the population was much smaller, the global population, and there was a lot of poverty. And where we arrived 50, 60 years later is that the population has boomed. And as a relation to the population, global poverty has shrunk. And there's a lot of conversations around that, especially around 2000 Millennium Development Goals, for example. And there's a lot of conversation that we've had in the US over the last years, decades, where baby boomers and their parents were used to an economy where the American economy was the biggest, most successful in the world. We didn't really have a lot of competition. We were out there with the Marshall Plan and other plans to help countries rise up. And we were so successful that now we have challengers. And so there's a sense that like, well, is America number one still? And there's a sense of grievance that we're not so far ahead of everybody else. But that was, to my mind, the beauty of the institutions that we created, which is we're all better off if we're all doing better. And so that's kind of the mindset that I have thinking about where we've been over the last few decades. And as I started my career and my education, it was really the 1990s. And the 1990s were really interesting. To me, it was a decade of promise. We had a new president, a young president, baby boomer president. We had the development of the internet, Windows 95. That was a big deal. Just the internet itself, Napster, super disruptive.
You guys don't remember Napster. You might
Probably
have
don't
read
remember
about
Napster. It was basically, instead of having to Now I'm really dating myself. Instead of having to go to the store, we used to love going to the store to Tower Records and buying CDs, right? Rummaging
Yeah.
through and buying them, taking them home, etc. Napster came along and you could get an MP3 and you could download it for free. So that was disruptive. Everything about the internet was disruptive, but promising. E-commerce was new and people, I remember it was 96, 97, people were like, this is a Christmas, like one of the first Christmases with Amazon. Will people actually trust putting their credit card into a computer that's connected? Will they trust that that book is going to arrive when they expect it to? Do they trust that something that says Amazon.com is really Amazon.com? So at the time, there was a big question about trust and whether trust was going to be the currency of the internet. And it was, it is. And also at the time, we had globalization. We had NAFTA, second trade deal we've really ever had. We had one with Israel in the 80s. It wasn't very comprehensive. We had NAFTA, super comprehensive. It was controversial at the time, and the politics around trade were new for the Congress, for the country. The country hadn't really focused on international trade that much because it was primarily just a question about tariff rates, boring, kind of like a tax. NAFTA changed that. It was about everything in the economy, services, investments, etc. And so it became a lightning rod. At the same time, the West, primarily driven by the US, was trying to transform the GATT. The GATT had expanded since the Second World War many times. There was an effort to create something called the World Trade Organization, which was an organization, rules-based, with enforceable rules. And when you say rules, what do you mean, right? Well, it includes tariffs, of course, but it's rules around intellectual property, rules around services, rules around non-discrimination. So you regulators can't treat foreign providers of services, for example, any differently than domestic ones. So we ended up creating the World Trade Organization from the GATT. NAFTA passed. We're implementing these things. The internet arrived. Everything seems to be new, interesting. The economy was roaring during the late 90s. Lots of disruption economically, culturally too. You had the grunge movement, which was a big deal, especially if you're from Seattle like me. But music was changing. Not only the content of it, but its distribution was disrupting record companies, distributors. It was disrupting record stores, even Best Buys and
I'm gonna do a quick
Kmart's.
interjection. Jayme, can you talk about your background in the music scene?
Yeah, so I had a little record label with some friends in the mid 90s. And it was great. It was a lot of fun. Spent 6 nights a week in rock clubs. But it was really interesting because you got to learn the book industry as much as the record industry. Because it's all about what people hear about. Music, you hear the music, or the book. And therefore, it's all who's deciding to publish a book, or who's deciding whether to put a band in the studio, who's paying for the production of the book, the band, and its distribution, which is really key. How do those records get onto record shelves? How do the books get onto bookshelves at a bookstore? And there aren't many bookstores anymore. There aren't any practically record stores. So everything was transformational at the time. And then what happened? We had Europe, Eurozone. We had currencies and the ability to move money around got a lot easier in the 90s. So again, in my view, decade of promise. One of the key books in the trade world that was being read at the time was Tom Friedman's The Lexus and the Olive Tree. Also a book about globalization, promise. Then we enter the 2000s, in my view.
And Y2K. You all may have read about, we
Right.
thought that on January 1st, 2000, that because computers we're not going to be able to transform from the 1990s, the 99 to 2000, that, we were told that planes would stop because the equipment couldn't register the right dates and the right times, and our computers will malfunction. Literally, like everything would have little wafts of smoke coming out of it. So January 1st, I remember waking up that morning after a New Year's Eve party thinking, nothing seems that different, So
The only bummer about Y2K is when it came to punching your birth date into the computer or whatever, we used to just write the last two. So for me, it was 73. Now it's 1973. Really? Anyway, that's Y2K. But yeah, so we had Y2K. And then what happened? Along the way, we had 9/11. We had the .com bust. All this promise, what's going on? Lots of young professionals moving across the country to work in the tech industry without jobs. The economy tanked for a while. We had a lot of partisanship. We had that controversial election. Remember that? 2000?
Yeah. About the time you were born, maybe.
Yeah. So between that and 9/11, things were changing. On the trade front and globalization front, it was still sort of like, let's keep moving forward. Let's not reconsider our past all that much. And so what Congress did, working with the Bush administration, was pass legislation on trade that made it easier for trade agreements to get through the Congress if those agreements have to go to Congress. And that legislation, which became law, also provides the contours, the negotiating objectives that the president has to adhere to for Congress to give him or her kind of the fast track authority. Basically, it's really legislation to hold, from Congress's point of view, it's legislation to hold the executive accountable for what it's doing on trade, which the Constitution says Congress should be doing. So it's a delegation of congressional power temporarily to the president. And in exchange, that whatever trade agreement the president negotiates, the way by which the Senate will consider it is an easier way towards passage than normal. For example, and I'll try to keep this simple, you hear about needing 60 votes in the Senate because there's the filibuster. This legislation, this law, lets you not have to have a filibuster. You can go around the filibuster. It's the fast track. You can save 10 votes, basically. So what happened? Bush got that authority, and there was a proliferation of new NAFTA-style trade agreements. The first two were Chile, Singapore,
Australia,
CAFTA, so it's all of Central America, Peru, Chile, Oman, Bahrain, Morocco.
Yeah.
I think I got most of Korea,
Yeah.
Colombia, and Panama. And most of those got through partisan votes until 2007, something changed. And that was the result of an election, 2006, when Democrats were put in charge of the House of Representatives. And they wanted to reconfigure trade so that trade agreements would incorporate stronger disciplines on labor rights for workers abroad and stronger rules related to the environment. Trade geeks call that May 7. That happened. The deal was reached between the Bush administration and House Democrats, led by then Speaker Pelosi. And as a result, trade agreements got renegotiated. Well, the ones that were pending did. Peru got through. And then we had another election. President Obama came in and renegotiated the other pending trade agreements to better incorporate standards that were reached between Pelosi and Bush. And this is by now we're late 2000s, right? And I kind of consider the 2000s and probably the 10 years after Obama, especially, is this reconsideration of globalization. We've seen all this technology and the disruption and the promise of the 90s, and then some challenges to that construct in the 2000s. And here we are in the 2010 and beyond. And is NAFTA the right model? I think everyone agrees no. Let's throw out the NAFTA playbook. Were the agreements post Pelosi and Bush and May 10, were those good enough? Probably not.
And Jayme, those agreements though did start to consider workers more, right? They were more
did.
expanding labor rights, environmental
did.
rights. So we already see that
Right.
the trade apparatus is thinking, what effect is this going to have on the people?
Exactly. And politicians, when they were trying to get the votes for those agreements, believed and promised what the outcomes would be. Better outcomes than NAFTA. And whether that happened or not, lots of reports on each one of those agreements. And those agreements take decades for them to see what the fruition is. But I would characterize, especially beginning around 2014, when Obama was trying to take the lessons of the Bush-Pelosi regime, the lessons, the hope of the 90s, and apply that to what was going on in the world and what the interests of the US were, in 2014. And that was the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations. So that is an agreement among like-minded countries in Southeast Asia and Western Hemisphere. The US is no longer a part of that agreement, but that agreement is in place. It is enforced. The US negotiated that, led the negotiations, especially on rules, digital economy, which is the new issue, and labor and environment. But there's still this tension. I mean, Trump came in and pulled the US out of that agreement. So you see this tension that exists between what to do about globalization. It's happening with or without us. Like, the internet's not going away. Economies are still growing. What's the US place in that? And, I think some believe that if the US just pulled out of TPP, it wouldn't happen. It still happened, just without us. And you saw, we all experienced this, and Manisha can speak more to this. When Trump came in, there was make America great again. And to me, that meant let's make it like the 1950s again, when the US was the biggest economy in the world. Nobody could challenge us. We could outwork anybody. And I think a lot of what you saw after Trump was elected was kind of a retrenchment in a way. You saw the tariffs go up. There weren't really new agreements that were reached. They were renegotiated agreements for the right reasons. And since then, with Biden's election, you haven't really seen unwinding of those Trump policies, right? Those tariffs are still in place. There's been, toes dipped in the water about opening foreign markets in terms of trade and pushing globalization, shaping globalization, but you haven't seen big outcomes yet. There's been a lot of engagement in Asia under the IPEF regime. You've seen that's included trade talks, that's included lots of other conversations led by the Departments of State and Commerce.
And Jayme, IPEF is sort of countering China. Can you talk a little bit?
It's just like, it's basically,
China.
it's like a TPP initiative, but without a conversation on tariffs.
Yeah.
It's basically what it is. There's also a conversation in the Americas, call it APEP, American Partnership for Economic Prosperity. And that's really kind of an effort to see if we can, how the US can kind of weave together all these free trade agreements, a lot of which were under Bush, but NAFTA's included, how you can kind of weave those trade agreements in the experiences and the lessons learned over the last couple of decades and move forward as a kind of a region together to address globalization's challenges and opportunities. But you still see, and especially as we head into this election, when it comes to globalization, there still remains tension. The economy, the American economy, is doing really well. And I saw a story coming in today, this afternoon, it's in the Post, about one of the reasons the economy is doing so well is because of immigration. It's just a story in the Post, check it out. So our economy is doing really well, but I don't know that the voters in Michigan and Wisconsin and Ohio and Pennsylvania feel the same way. So you might have these macro numbers that say, in terms of globalization, things seem to be really good for the US, especially coming out of the, managing the pandemic and coming out of it. But that doesn't mean that that's felt by American families. And so therefore, what to do, especially if you're running for federal office. And we're going to see over the next 6 months what Americans think, how they're doing. And that's really the confounding challenge for federal officials, is how do you look out for the broad interests of the country while recognizing the more localized interest, challenges, and opportunities that American families face. And that, in a way, is the beauty of the way that our system of government's put together. Yeah, we have a president, and we have a Senate and a House. And as you get further down, you get closer and closer to voters and to families. And every 2 years, we have an election that matters a lot.
Changes things, yeah.
Yeah. So I think I'm
Yeah. Well,
on
let
time,
me pose the
close.
first question.
Okay.
You all can think about all of the questions you want to ask. But so, Ambassador White, when it comes to globalization, one of the themes we've explored here, especially with the COGOD Women in Business, and one of the things that was important to me at the department, as I've mentioned, is including everybody in the benefits of economic prosperity. When you think about your time as Deputy United States Trade Representative, what sorts of measures or what sort of broad conversations did you have in terms of U.S. trade policy so that we make sure that every spectrum of society can be included in the benefits of a prosperous global economy?
First, officials have to get outside of Washington.
Yeah. Absolutely.
However, you have to be in Washington because everyone's here, right?
Yeah.
You have to be around for your coffees, for your visits, for people who want to come to Washington and convey their views. I think structurally, especially on trade, but this exists elsewhere, you have to have mechanisms by which anybody can dock into a process to have their voice heard on matters affecting government, but especially, including matters affecting trade, jobs, economic security for themselves and for their families. In the trade arena, we have advisory committees, for example, so different sectors of the economy can designate people to go talk to USTR, the Trade Representative's Office, et cetera. And that includes people from civil society and from labor unions and from environmental groups. So you try to do that. But what I think, especially, I spent 20 years on the Hill, on Capitol Hill, before going and becoming, Deputy USTR, as members of Congress, they're really close to people. They go back home to their districts and they campaign every 2 years. Members of the House do. They have their town halls. They go on local radio, they're around. And so you have to, I think, to get the best outcomes on policy, you've got to make sure that your elected officials in the House, in the Senate, know what's going on so they can convey that to their constituents. And so their constituents can know enough to convey what they think to their elected official. So in other words, you got to find ways to promote transparency so that individuals, if they are interested, can know what's at stake, especially when it comes to trade, what's at stake in Washington right now, what's the conversation? And not just Washington, what are the people that we elect to go to Washington? What are they doing in Brussels? What are they advocating for in Brussels or Geneva or London, et cetera? This week, for example, there's a big World Trade Organization meeting in Dubai right now. And the US is a big player there, but all the WTO members are there, and it's an institution that's governed by consensus. And right now, what's at stake? What are the big issues at stake? It's fish, it's the role of the WTO, it's digital trade. Those are the big things. How would you know? Luckily, you can find out. It's reported on, and there are ways to find out. But if you wanted to find out and you couldn't, what would you say to your member of Congress? Members of Congress send letters all the time to the executive branch. But if their constituents don't know what's going on, how do the members of Congress know what to ask for on their behalf, right? They are the voice of their constituents. So I'm a big believer in transparency as to what's at stake, engaging with the public, and telling the public what we're up. Not we, I'm not in government anymore, but what's at stake and what's happening or what could happen, so they can be informed and they can get to their elected members of Congress to inform what the White House thinks about things.
I think that's a good segue to turn to questions from our audience. Alyssa,
Hi, the question that I have
can you
is,
state your name and
Oh,
your
yes.
affiliation?
I'm Alyssa and I'm one of the student associates and I'm in school public affairs. My question is that because social media feels like it's in infancy sometimes, how do you foresee it impacting globalization going forward, especially with new developments like TikTok Shop, Facebook Marketplace, that one click, like one place, like shopping platforms? We don't really know the impacts yet because they all feel very new. How do you see that moving forward affecting the economy?
We'll see. I kind of put that in the category in a way of digital trade. We policymakers didn't know what to do with the internet internationally early on. It was seen as sort of, the internet is my recollection, I'm no historian, but my recollection is when the internet hit the scene and people were emailing and they were blogging, and there were these message boards that you can join. And today, Facebook and all these, they're just, evolution of those early days, right? And it was kind of viewed as the internet was like the public square. It was like a public town hall. Isn't this cool? And it still is, just it's segmented, it's very broad. We all know the challenges. But federal policymakers at the time didn't know quite what to make of this. But they thought, and still believe, I believe this, is that the more voices that are out there communicating to each other, that's good for democracy, for speech, for empowering people. And we've seen that. We've seen revolutions on lots of issues over the years. We've seen China put up a firewall because they don't want speech, right? We've seen other countries do that too. Turkey, the list goes on. And so the democratizing power of the internet was evident by speech. And then over time, we realized this is an economic issue too. Because when you start blocking the New York Times or name your, outfit where there's speech, that's also affecting commerce. And so this conversation about the internet and digital is like, it's not that much different to trade in bits and bytes and files than it is in widgets and cars and you name it. So how do we think about the internet is commerce as much as it is speech? And the internet and the technology has transformed everything. The digital economy has democratized trade. There are more traders today than there ever have been. Somebody who goes on Etsy and sells their stuff to somebody in Australia is a trader, right? They're thinking about customs, they're thinking about transit times, etc. So getting the rules of digital trade right are really important. And that's why it's a subject in Dubai right now. It's a subject here in DC. It's going to be going forward. But, I think the rules of the road around digital are difficult. I think a lot of those rules domestically we got right. We have to reconsider them all the time.
They're evolving.
They're evolving. Technology evolves, and Washington's always trying to catch up.
Yeah.
Sometimes we get it right. Sometimes.
Melissa, here's an interesting fact for you all. This year, 2024, is going to see some of the biggest elections in history. Over 50% of the world's population is going to the polls this year. That, of course, includes the United States. India, which you all may have seen, is now the most populous country in the world. And then there's other countries in the world who, put elections in quotes, like Venezuela, we're technically having an election. The UK is likely to see its parliamentary election before the end of 2024. So over 50% of the world's population. And you mentioned, social media, things like TikTok and Instagram and Facebook. And we all know that there's so much information out there and misinformation out there. So this is going to be a particularly interesting and important year for us to view social media and its effect literally on who governs and rules the world. And there's also, Jayme, you mentioned the New York Times. There's also the cases right now that are pending, the Florida and Texas cases on, both sides are saying that they're arguing for freedom of speech. There's conservative platforms saying, well, we're being kept off, therefore our freedom of speech is being denied. And then the platforms are saying, well, we're private enterprises, we're not government, so you can't force us to have certain speech on. So that's, you're bridging our First Amendment rights. And so I find it interesting that both sides are saying, no, First Amendment, we're being walked on, our First Amendment rights. So we'll see what comes out. I hope you all are watching those. I'm one of these people who reads the news every day just to see what little things come out. Okay, next question. Yes.
My name's Aiden. I'm in the School of Public Affairs. I'm a sophomore. My question is, with the rise of a more multipolar world, like you mentioned, like 50, 60 years ago, the US was the clear dominant economic power, but with the multipolar world where we both rely on our enemies for trade, like with China, for example, we rely on them for trade, but we're also like an adversary of them just from like a military and intelligence standpoint. How do you think that relationship with our adversaries, like weighing the economic benefits with the security benefits, how do you think that's going to play out over the next decade or so, especially considering we might have change in parties in the presidency soon?
I can start with a couple of thoughts on that and let Jayme finish as well. The relationship with China is one that we have to manage. I keep hearing this term decoupled being applied to the US-China relationship. I find that incredibly implausible. We are the first and second largest economies in the world. We're inextricably linked. So many of our goods and services and products for decades have been coming from China. So how do you decouple from the Chinese economy? I think that would be virtually impossible. And you made a great observation that now it's not only about the commercial relationship, but also the strategic and military front. I'll give you an example. When I worked I was in the State Department in 2007, 2008. At the time, we were still having dialogues with China. I was a part of the Strategic Economic Dialogue, which was led by then Secretary Condoleezza Rice and Secretary of Treasury Hank Paulson. I actually went to China. I remember in 2008, we had a dialogue on innovation and commercialization. The point of that dialogue was to talk to the Chinese government about not stealing intellectual property, about allowing US companies equal access to their market. Chinese companies can easily come here and sell goods and products, with certain exceptions, but the US is a relatively open, free market. Chinese companies have done very well here. American companies wanted that same reciprocity. So we were still having the conversation and thought this is something where we can move forward. We have supported China's entry into the World Trade Organization, which Jayme mentioned. This was around 2001. So we sort of let them in, we sort of gave them the prize and then told them that they have to follow the rules later. I think in retrospect, a lot of people would say we should have had a period where we asked them to follow the rules first and then let them in, and then you get the prize at the end. But that's the way it worked. It was to the benefit of the American consumer because we have a lot of goods and products. If you go to Walmart, if anybody's shopped at Walmart or Target or any of these retail establishments over the last several decades, the American household has been the beneficiary of relatively low cost of goods. But, as I alluded to earlier, it means that manufacturing has gone overseas as well. So there's been a cost to the American workforce. let's fast forward to 2017, 2018, in 2019, sort of the pre-COVID days. It's a different conversation. So this time when I was at the State Department, I didn't go to China. Our travel, senior officials, you had to get permission to go from a very political perspective of who from the US government is going to go to China. So, we had conversations here in town, with our allies on what's going on with China. Now, all of a sudden, the intellectual property theft is not just Microsoft Office or electronic software. It's not CDs and movies and the Prada handbags that you can buy for $20. I remember the first time I was in Shanghai or somewhere and I was on the street and I was like, what a find. It's a Louis Vuitton bag and it's only $15. And then I thought, oh, okay, this is this is not actually a Louis Vuitton bag. So that realization kind of hit me. But now it's, and that of course is so important because it's an economic form of espionage. But let's flash forward. Now, if, Chinese incursions are into our intellectual property in terms of artificial intelligence, which you all know artificial intelligence is the theme of the year. We've all seen ChatGPT and we're going to see more and more iterations of that. If it comes to like quantum computing, to robotics, I don't know if you all have seen the Will Smith movie, I, Robot. That movie scares me, especially now. I'm like, well, what is happening? But if the Chinese intellectual property theft and theft of our secrets is at that level, all of a sudden, these are things that can be used in the Chinese military that directly impact our national security. If you have measures where, I was reading something, I think I received a briefing at the State Department at some point about the ability of Chinese radar to disable American naval ships in the South China Sea, that are nearby. That's something scary to think about. So that's no longer just commercial intellectual property theft. This is a direct ability to impact our military and our national security. So just, as an initial answer to your question, and Jayme, I turn to you for thoughts.
I guess going back to the decoupling question, and multipolar world with actors that are growing in influence. I got this question from a particular senator during my confirmation, and we were going through all the trade issues, and I expected every single question, and I expected this one too. But he said, okay, so where are we going to be on the decoupling with China front with this administration, this being the new Biden administration? And my answer on decoupling was similar to yours. It's the second largest economy in the world. We're not going to decouple. We're going to, try to mitigate the challenges that we have, and we have challenges, but it's the second largest economy. You can't drain the Pacific. The goods are coming over, right? So it's the world we live in. And, when it comes to multipolar, perhaps that's better than, for a long time, it was the US and the Soviets, right? And everybody else was caught in the middle. And here today we have more poles of influence. And it reminds me a bit of the House of Representatives, where it's coalition building to get things done. And you've seen this with, now I'm delving into not trade, but it's kind of trade. You've seen this with Ukraine and real tests around NATO, and the ability for the US and others to build coalitions, multipolar coalitions, to deal with a common challenge, and that is the illegal invasion of Ukraine and the violence against Ukraine by Russia. And so multiple poles involved in that, and that will be the case going forward. And so that's why diplomacy matters, shared values matters, speech matters.
Our allies matter.
Our allies matter.
Absolutely.
Exactly. So when you see, multilateral fora matters, OECD, United Nations, it goes on and on. Your question around social media, I'm sitting here thinking about it, and I mentioned trust is the currency of the internet. And one thing where Amazon did a good job of this, but other online platforms e-commerce platforms quickly realized this is a good thing, and that is ratings, seller ratings. You get a 5, you get a 1, something's wrong there. You get reviews, and so you can kind of test, is this product I'm buying off a platform, is it counterfeit or not? Because there are counterfeits online, and so that was a way to build trust as to what you're getting. Now, when you're buying something, when you're forking over your credit card, you're going to do a little research on what you're getting. When you're just perusing TikTok and God knows what and getting information that way, you're probably not reading reviews and going to Snopes.com to see if this is actually right. Like, the only time I go to Snopes is when a member of my family posts something absurd on Facebook, and there's nothing more fun than posting a Snopes, like legit. But we haven't quite figured that out with social media yet, right? So that's a big challenge, and it does create an environment where people don't trust so much what they're seeing online, I think.
Yeah. Any other questions? Florence?
So I'm studying sustainability management at the Kogat School of Business. And with that, I'm curious if you can each talk about building capacity, as far as like how the trade deals in order to measure or evaluate success. And maybe the power program. I would just like to hear you to talk about building capacity and
Well, Florence, power is one of my favorite topics. So I'm anytime anyone asks me to talk about power, I'm so excited to talk about it. You and I discussed it a little bit briefly. I might have mentioned it before, but I'll give you a recap. So power is providing opportunities for women's economic rise. And it was a program that I founded at the State Department, and it came with funding, which at the State Department it's impossible to find funding for sort of pet programs. But this I felt was very, very important. I talked to the secretary about it, and he agreed with me. And one of the things, both in terms of your question about sustainability and impact, is I know there are a lot of forums for discussion. I'm a lawyer, so there are women lawyers groups, journalist groups, and I think that those have great value. Getting together and networking and talking about shared experiences, I think those are, again, provide a lot of value. But what I really wanted to do with power is provide something that looked at skills gaps and resource gaps. So I'll give you a statistic. I learned from friends in the venture capital industry that only 3% of venture capital funding goes to women-owned startups. When I first saw that number, I thought, oh no, somebody is lowering that number just to create a cause or to make it seem like, resources aren't going to women. But, I looked around at different studies. McKinsey, the consulting firm McKinsey, did a report on women in business. I kept seeing the similarly low numbers. And I thought, this is an actual real number. This is crazy to me. And this would have been probably, 2019 or so. So, pre-COVID, but still relatively recently. And I thought, how can this be? I know women in my peer group, certainly younger women, people in your peer group who have these great ideas. Why are women-owned startups not getting funded? Is it a case of, lack of confidence in women? What's going on? So I delved a little further, and I talked to a friend a woman who is a senior executive at a venture firm in Europe. And she said, we would love to find women-owned, minority-owned, the range, the full spectrum of different businesses to fund as startups. But in the case of women, we don't even have women-owned startups come to the pitch competitions. We will advertise broadly. If your startup, if you have a pitch.com, we will give you a 10-minute slot in our program, and you can pitch to a room full of venture capital investors, sort of like a matchup session. And she told me that women aren't even coming. And so that's, when I thought with power, let's see what we can do to, even if we don't identify the exact reason for that, how can we help solve that issue? So one of the things I did was we sent out a notice to embassies all over the world and said, we will provide funding for an embassy program. And I wanted 2 requirements. I wanted a concrete deliverable result, like, a training, a skills gap sort of thing, not just a networking session. And then I wanted a US nexus, because as the Economic Bureau wanted some tie for the embassy program to somewhere in the United States. we got so many great proposals. And I'll give you one that's an example where that actually involves the trade agenda. We had our US consulate in Tijuana in Mexico teamed with a Mexican women, it was a women's organization that was an NGO to put together a proposal with a woman-owned business group in San Diego, just across the border in California. And they wanted to provide a training session for women, for small and medium-sized enterprises. It was going to be open to everyone, not just women, but a lot of the SMEs are women-owned, on how to utilize the benefits of the US-Mexico-Canada agreement, which you'll recall was NAFTA. The renegotiated NAFTA was, they labeled it USMCA, because you can't say trade anymore. Trade is a word that doesn't go over well with the American people. So, USMCA, there were a lot of benefits for businesses doing trading cross-border. That would be Mexico. California is one of the easiest examples to give there. And if you're a large company, if you're a large enterprise and you want tariff-free access, you have a lawyer, you have a lobbyist, you have so many people that can advise you on how to take advantage of the benefits of USMCA, right? But if you're a 50-person small shop, woman-owned enterprise somewhere in Tijuana, somewhere in the northern Mexico vicinity, you don't really know. You're like, okay, I read USMCA. I don't know what to do with this. So we had people from the consulates, trade experts from the State Department, from the Commerce Department come and provide the skills training on exactly how you can take advantage of these benefits. And we had success stories. We had women on both sides of the border that were able to increase their business opportunities because of this training session. So that was the concrete deliverable result and the connection to Mexico. And we had stories like this all over the world. There was another one where we partnered with MasterCard, the MasterCard company. They have a small business incubator. They worked with our embassy in Jakarta and Indonesia to similarly help provide women with an ability to do the pitch competitions that I mentioned earlier, how to find them, how to get your startup funded. And I got notes from 3 different women-owned startups that were successfully funded. So for me, even just getting 3 of these small, and they're women-owned, but remember, it's not just women that work there. They employ a range of people. So small and medium enterprises, when they thrive, economies all over the world thrive. And as Ambassador White mentioned, there's the World Bank, the IMF, everybody has done studies that show that when women participate fully in the labor force, the GDPs and the economies of nations rise. So this isn't just like a gender issue. This is an economic issue. It makes the world better. It creates employment opportunities for everyone. So that's why I'm such a firm believer in really engaging everyone in the labor force.
Yeah, what she said. A couple of anecdotes. I was in Sao Paulo 6 months ago, and I was meeting with a bunch of women entrepreneurs, advocates, etc. And we were talking about trade, and COVID hit women and families really hard in Brazil for a lot of reasons. We got to the conversation around technology, and we were talking about deployment of broadband, what it means, and how they're coping with it. We've had our own challenges. We have rural areas in the United States of America where you can't get legit broadband, right? And the Recovery Act of 2008 went a long way towards that, but we're not there yet. So think about these other countries like Brazil. It's huge. And so we were talking about that, and then I said something like, well, what about, okay, you got a broadband connection, great. Do you have how are you connecting to it? Do they have money for computers and iPad, whatever the platform? Another big challenge. But once women are empowered with devices and access to connectivity, it makes a big difference. You said sustainability, which to me is like catnip, but let me first start with one of 2 things that I've noticed over the last few years. 2 issues in trade that are relatively new, or there's a stronger focus on it. The first issue is supply chains. COVID really showed us that consumers relying on one place for certain products is a recipe for disaster, and we've seen that. I was in Moldova, for example, And the war had just broken out, so I was having a conversation with my counterpart about energy. And of course, they were heading into winter when I was there, so they were thinking about gas and how the heck they're going to heat, how the Moldovans are going to heat their houses. And the energy situation is way more complex than you think, because those pipelines crisscrossing Europe, they're spigots. The countries control what's going, so perhaps the Austrians want to keep the gas for themselves before letting gas go to other countries in the region. So it's really complicated. And I started asking questions about renewables and GHG emissions and climate and Paris and sustainability, because that's the other big focus in trade. That's a development that's only increased in intensity over the last few years. And at the time I asked that question, something was going on in Brussels. The European Commission was passing something on a package on renewables. And my counterpart said, you know what, we are all for solar, 100%. But guess what? We're trying to find ways to get gas from somewhere other than Russia. And 90% of the world's solar panels are made in China. So we're going to, substitute one for the other. What do we do? So that's the supply chain issue, and sustainability is in there. And there's lots of conversations all around the world to try and figure out ways in which we can promote a lower carbon economy to deal with climate change, right? We know what's happening. How do we promote trade that's lower carbon? And I'm going to try and weave this together. This is going to be difficult, but I'm going to try to do it on the fly. The sustainability question and trade relates to things like steel, super carbon intensive. And that's part of the conversations we've been having with Europe and other countries around whether the tariffs stay or go. How clean is your production? It's a conversation we're having at home too, in terms of steel production. It's a conversation we have in the timber sector, believe it or not. When you have stolen wood coming in from the Far East, competing with American sustainably harvested trees, that's an economic issue. It's a sustainability issue. And we've had this issue with solar. China controls 90% of the world's solar production. They did it by engaging in unfair trade practices.
Stealing our IP.
Not just our IP, but dumping and subsidization, the list goes on. So these are economic issues, there's sustainability issues, but also you might think to yourself, or some might think to themselves as they read the papers, like, oh, I'm not a steel worker. Doesn't matter to me what's going on. I don't work in the timber sector. I'm not cutting down trees. My dad didn't make solar panels. Like, this doesn't affect me. But in fact, it does. I'll give you one anecdote. So in the Pacific Northwest, Washington State, Oregon, and other parts of the country, especially the South, Georgia, et cetera, the timber industry is a really important industry. And the big challenge they have with, in addition to stolen timber from overseas, is unfair trade practices deployed by who? Canada. The Canadians.
Canadians aren't always as nice to us as it seems.
Correct. This has been decades challenge,
Yeah.
et cetera. And so we have anti-dumping duties in place, et cetera. But one of the ads that our timber producers put up when there were conversations in Washington about this issue, about what to do about it, the ads included owners of the local diner, the people that worked at the diner, the people that worked in these timber towns and that relied on a vibrant timber economy. It's not just the people cutting down trees, it's the people driving trucks. It's the entire economy. The same is true for the steel industry, the solar industry, you name the industry. It's not just those direct workers, it's the jobs and the communities they support that are impacted by the challenges of trade and globalization and unfair trade practices. These questions around sustainability are going to be increasingly important, especially as Europe is considering tariffs on our own products that are not produced as cleanly as they think their products are.
Tangential effects of globalization. John Mitchell. I guarantee you're going to be sympathetic. You're going to read about him. You're going to be like, poor John and everything that happens to him. Okay, let's take maybe one or two more questions and then we can, anybody who wants to stay and mingle can stay and we can wrap up. So.
I'll pick one up. New business. But while I'm hearing you guys talk, I think of like what are alternatives to China, right? And the question that pops into my mind is that I know that there's very low confidence in like Latin America and other countries more in terms of having, first of all, a stable country, but also a country that has like rule of law, stable court systems that bring U.S. businesses. What are trade representatives in the state government doing to promote that? And what are the results? Obviously, we've seen that democracy decrease across the world, and the rule of law has obviously fallen.
Very good question.
So at USTR, there are 3 deputy positions. There's the one for the Geneva slot, we call it, which is the WTO. And then there's the slot for like the Asia slot. And then there's the slot that I lucked out to get, which was Western Hemisphere and Europe. And let me just focus on Western Hemisphere, because that's a great alternative. I mentioned supply chains. When you get into the conversation around supply chains, you hear terms like nearshoring, friendshoring, et cetera.
Shoring.
Right. What's that mean? Well, if you look at Western Hemisphere, if you look at Western Hemisphere, what do you see? You see Canada and Mexico. They border us. We've got open relationships, mature relationships with democracies, right? Rule of law. There are always questions around rule of law. There are always elections. Here in the US, there's always elections. What I learned, I hit the ground running when I was deputy, and I was going from country to country to country, and I was like, build relationships. The US is back, because there wasn't a lot of travel under the last administration. And it seemed like I'd go somewhere, come back, and a few weeks later, there's an election, their new government. And the country might not be changing course all that much, but all the officials were wiped out. So that's why you have to keep going and going and going. I think I had 4 counterparts in the UK in the course of like 6 months, because they right?
4 prime ministers
Right.
in a year.
So you just have to keep at it. But let me focus on Western Hemisphere and to some extent Europe. Western Hemisphere, we have more free trade agreements and more legal constructs than any other region of the world. And they're mature. South America, Central America, I already mentioned USMCA/NAFTA. So that is a good place to look to, but also Europe. We've got rule of law. We may not have a free trade agreement with the European Union, but over the course of decades of GATT expansions and tariff reductions, the trade we have between Europe is robust, and rule of law is not an issue there. American companies are getting sued all the time. In Europe, for example, there's a robust economic relationship and dialogue. So I think that when you think about alternatives to China, you look to Western Hemisphere and you look to Europe.
Okay, well, so let's take one last question and then we'll wrap up, and anybody else can stay and mingle. We'll Ambassador Wright and I will hang out. So any last questions? Okay, well then, in the back.
Firstly, thank you for being with us here and giving us your time. My name is Sanjana, and I'm first-year Masters in Business Administration student from Cohort for the Business, and also honored to be part of Cohort Women in Business.
Oh, great.
The question that I would like to ask, or rather have your take on, is how much power do you think economic diplomacy has on foreign commercial and financial relations in support of foreign policy?
Oh, Sanjana, that's what an excellent question, and what a perfect question for me. I'll start with this one. Economic diplomacy is, that's exactly, I think that's exactly what I've done during my career in Washington, whether it was the private sector or the public sector. I've always considered myself an economic diplomat. I think that, people underestimate soft power, which is, I think, when you refer to economic diplomacy, and the ability to just have conversations and negotiations and things with your counterpart, like Jayme referred to. Sometimes you have to go back, and you have to go back when a government changes and keep getting to know the people. But I have found that sometimes those relationships provide the best foundation, especially during the difficult times, because we do have a great trading relationship with Europe. But the Europeans sometimes, they institute rules and things that may not be as good for our companies as for theirs. I'll give you an example of one of the things that happened when I was in office. So the Europeans, different countries in Europe instituted a digital services tax. And the digital services tax, they said, is not targeted at any particular country. It's just a broader tax on digital activity happening in their countries. And as you know, with the internet, all of a sudden, before, you can tax work based on a place somebody's working, or even if you buy a product, you can tax that product. Like you live in Florida, you buy the product from Texas, there's a structure where you can tax things because it's a service or a good. But all of a sudden, you have the digital economy. How do you tax activity? And so this digital services tax was imposed by various members of the European Union. The effects were disproportionately on American companies. Why? Because it's Facebook, it's LinkedIn, it's Instagram, it's WhatsApp, it's all of these, YouTube, all of the primarily the tech companies that were affected by it happened to be American companies. And the Europeans said, not intended. That's just so happens, that you're a victim of your own success, so to speak. And so I thought, well, okay, we've got to solve this issue. I have people from Google, I have the senior executives from Google, everybody, Facebook calling me saying this is significant amounts of revenue for us. We think it violates national treatment under the World Trade Organization. We think it violates all kinds of rules. So this is when my relationships came in handy. So I had to go to I remember going to different capitals. I was in Spain, I was in Madrid, I was in Rome, I was in Paris, I was in Brussels, just, on other topics, but certainly this was a main topic, and I found that people were willing to have the conversation with me because I knew them. The economic minister in Rome, in Italy, I had met her at conferences, we had stayed in touch, and we had the exact same portfolio, just a similar outlook on the world. So I called her, and I said, I'm going to be in Rome. Can I stop by and can I see you? And can we have a conversation with this? And I actually made some headway. I mean, she was actually willing. I was surprised because she was willing to take my point of view to her senior officials, to the head of her department, at least say, look, the Americans are here and they've pointed out a lot of things, a lot of benefits that we get. YouTube and Google, like Google has a huge office in Milan. So Google employs 1,000 Italians there. And then on top of that, you're taxing us. So I pointed out all these things. And so for me, that economic diplomacy that you talk about, it's the relationships, and it's about the ability to have that conversation and resolve these trade and commercial issues with our allies and come together as well. The question earlier about the multipolar world, although the US and China are the two largest economies in the world, every country produces something important, is important in the world economy in a different way. And I feel like those relationships are so incredibly important. And I also feel like you don't have to be a government official, or a senior business leader to be an economic diplomat. All of you, some of you are probably from different countries that are studying here. Some of you are going to go to different countries, study abroad. When you go on vacation with your family, you're going to different shops, different, just interacting with people all over the world. And you are going to leave a lasting impression. They're going to say that person, that young American who came to my shop, either they were rude and nasty and I didn't like them. And that's you are the only American that they've met. So that's what they think now. Or that young American who came in, made an effort to say hello and please and thank you in the local language and asked about the items in my shop, maybe did or didn't buy anything. But you are some of the best ambassadors, some of the best diplomats out there. So never think just because you're not working in the State Department or you're a senior official or you're not Bill Gates or Elon Musk, that you're not going to have an incredibly important impact. And that's the thought that I think I will leave you with. I want to thank Ambassador White for his very wise comments. And I think we can stay a few minutes to talk to any of you that you like.
I have one thing to say on the point, just an example. So when I would travel, my counterpart is often what we call the Secretary of State. So sometimes trade and state or
Yeah.
depending on the government. And issues are never really siloed. So the first thing I would do when I landed in a country is go to the US Embassy and get a briefing about all the matters. So I know how much is at stake in terms of military aid, foreign aid in general. I know what's on the table. And there's a lot on the table typically. And so we would have our formal meetings and then we'd always have a lunch or a dinner. And the coolest thing, a lot of cool things about the job that I had, but when you have a pull aside, you pull your counterpart aside with nobody around, you say, you know, you talked about 10 things, I talked about 10 things. Here's what's important to the United States.
Relationship.
And you say that, and say that was the morning session when you mentioned that issue, you had your lunch, you pull aside. And I've had this happen where that minister who was showing no signs of support for what we were asking for comes back from lunch and says, we're going to pursue the following upon reflection. And was it just because it was a trade issue? No. So just because of a relationship? No, but it all weaves together. It all weaves together. It's a relationship like any other.
Absolutely. Well, thank you all so much for participating in this great event. We really appreciate your time and your interest.
Okay.